The 13th episode of Season 6 for Star Trek Deep Space Nine was the episode named Far Beyond the Stars, which premiered on February 9, 1998. In this episode, Nana Visitor played the character of Kay Eaton, who was a science fiction writer who wrote under the pseudonym of K.C. Hunter during the 1950s in New York City, writing for Incredible Tales magazine. The character of Kay Eaton was supposedly written to be inspired by science fiction writer Catherine Moore, who published many science fiction and heroic fantasy stories from the 1930s to the 1960s. In this video you will get to learn about the life of Catherine Moore and her journey as both a writer and storyteller. Catherine Lucille Moore was born in Indianapolis, Indiana on January 24, 1911. After graduating from Arsenal Technical High School, Catherine went to Indiana University, where she was able to get 3 of her stories published for the university's student-run magazine called The Vagabond during the years of 1930 and 1931. Due to the Great Depression, Catherine dropped out of college and applied for a job in 1932 at Fletcher Trust Company, which was a bank where her jobs were being a stenographer and then later becoming a private secretary for the president of the bank. While Catherine was working at the bank, she continued writing and in 1933 submitted her story named Shamblo to a magazine called Pulp Magazine Weird Tales, where they published her story that year in November. This story became Catherine's first professional sale as an author. Catherine's next story featured in Pulp magazine was published in April of 1934 called Black Thirst, which featured the continuation of Catherine's main character from her story Shamblo, whose name was Northwest Smith. In October of 1934, Catherine got published her new story that she wrote called Black God's Kiss, that had a brand new protagonist whose name was Jairil of Jawari. Catherine had 16 of her stories published in Pulp magazine Weird Tales during the 1930s, where Catherine had all of them used the name C. L. Moore as the name of the author. In 1936, Henry Kuttner, who was a writer of science fiction and fantasy, wrote a fan letter to Catherine, but Henry had actually written the letter to C. L. Moore, where he was originally under the impression that C. L. Moore was a man. Catherine and Henry eventually met in person and they decided to collaborate together for writing stories, where in 1937 their first story was published called Quest of the Star Stone. In 1940 Catherine and Henry got married, where they continued for many years writing stories together as a team. Some of Catherine and Henry's best-known work included Mimsy with the Borogovs from 1943, which was the basis for the story used in the movie The Last Mimsy from 2007. They also wrote the story Vintage Season from 1946, which was the basis for the story used in the movie Timescape from 1992. Catherine still wrote her own stories, many appearing throughout the 1940s in Astounding Science magazine, where many of her short stories were later collected and put into one book that was released in 1952 called Judgment Night. Starting in 1950, both Catherine and Henry attended the University of Southern California to study English literature. Catherine graduated in 1956 and the following year published her first novel called Doomsday Morning in 1957. In February of 1958, tragedy struck when Henry suffered a heart attack and died at the age of 42. Before his death, Catherine and Henry were getting ready to start a new career opportunity in Hollywood, as they were both going to begin writing screenplays. They were able to write one script that was aired on television, which was the pilot episode for a show called Tales of Frankenstein, which premiered in 1958. After Henry's death, Catherine continued to write screenplays until 1962. She wrote episodes for TV shows such as Sugarfoot, Maverick, The Alaskans, The Twilight Zone, and 77 Sunset Strip. Catherine was teaching a writer's class at the University of Southern California from 1958 till 1961, along with going for her master's degree, which she received in 1964. In 1963 Catherine married her second husband Thomas Reggie, where after their marriage Catherine stopped writing entirely and her retirement was due to speculation that her new husband wished for her not to be writing her stories anymore. Catherine worked on compiling all of her Gyral of Jwari stories and put the collection into her final book, which released in 1969. In 1981 Catherine was honored with the World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement and she was inducted into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame in 1998. Later in life Catherine developed Alzheimer's disease and died on April 4, 1987 at her home in Hollywood, California at the age of 76. Catherine Moore became an influential author in the genres of science fiction and fantasy. With its literary quality, stories like Shamblo sparked a revolution in science fiction that emphasized sophisticated cerebral explorations and emotional depth. Fellow authors from the period characterized Moore's legacy as raising science fiction to a credible literary field, as she was one of the first women to write in the genre and paved the way for many other female writers to come in speculative fiction.